This week in Idaho, we talk about Idaho's illegal immigrant workforce, how a wave of layoffs is going through Albertsons, a judge overturns the Biden administration's Title IX changes, citing Overreach, our Idaho Congressman co-sponsors a bill to dismantle the ATF, that and so much more. This is the Yokel Idaho Midweek Report, where we give you a quick overview of the news in Idaho for the last week. Hey, glad to have you here with us today, especially after Trump got inaugurated this week. That's a very nice thing that puts a smile on my face. But another thing that is tied with Donald Trump and something related to Idaho here is the illegal immigrant workforce. It does play a significant role in the state's economy. If you looked on our Twitter page, I made a comment or a post or something like that to that effect, where it's very heavy in the agriculture or dairy industry. As of 2021, an estimated 30,000 unauthorized immigrants, or illegal immigrants, were part of Idaho's workforce, with 1/3 employed in agriculture. Because of this huge amount, recent legislative efforts aim to crack down on illegal immigrants. Representative Jaron Crane introduced a bill in the House State Affairs Committee that would give Idaho law enforcement authority to arrest and deport individuals living in the U.S. without authorization. This move mirrors similar legislation in Texas, which is currently facing some legal challenges, so we may join them in that issue there. But as for the reaction on the bill, it has sparked some debate about the economic impact of illegal workers versus the need for stricter immigration enforcement. While some argue these workers are essential for industries like dairy and farming, others, the majority of us, believe that relying on illegal immigrants for labor is unsustainable, potentially exploitive, and erodes our national sovereignty. As Idaho grapples with this issue, along with the rest of the nation right now, but we'll see how it goes with the Trump administration, we must balance economic needs, legal considerations, and ethical concerns surrounding our illegal immigrant workforce. And speaking of workforces, and not one deporting, but more cutting, Albertsons, the Boise-based grocery chain, has initiated a significant round of layoffs affecting its employees across multiple states. The company confirmed that job cuts began on January 14th, 2025, impacting positions in Boise, Arizona, Oregon, California, and Texas. While Albertsons has not disclosed the exact number of affected employees, the scale of the layoffs appears to be substantial from things going on in social media. Specifically for Albertsons' stance, in a statement, they said that they emphasized that no store-level associates were impacted, more focusing instead on reducing the size of their corporate and division support workforce. The company cited the need to find a, quote, new source of productivity, end quote, to invest in growth as the reason for this decision. As for how it's all being handled, Albertsons is offering severance packages, extended benefits, and care support services to affected employees. Additionally, the company revealed plans to offshore some roles as part of its strategy to increase productivity and competitiveness in the market. Kind of sad on that, but I can see, especially after the merger. Moving forward, this comes in the wake of Albertsons' failed merger with Kroger and aligns with the company's goal to find $1.5 billion in efficiency over the next 3 years. And speaking of things in court, and one of the ones we teased there, in a landmark decision, a federal judge in Kentucky has struck down President Biden's Title IX rule, which aimed to extend discrimination protections to LGBTQ plus students. Chief Judge Danny Reeves ruled that the U.S. Department of Education overstepped its authority by extending Title IX to include gender identity and sexual orientation. For a little bit of broader context, if you haven't been regularly listening to the show, if this is your first time, or haven't just been keeping up with this specific case, the first Title IX suit, filed with the U.S. Supreme Court by Idaho Attorney General Raul Labrador in August of 2024, to vacate the Biden administration's unlawful ruling, was vacated by the court. This new nationwide ruling was issued just days before President-elect Trump took office, invalidating the Biden administration's 1,500-page regulation. It's amazing how government, you're going to make two changes. You're just going to say it's going to be gender ideology and pronouns and stuff. And what does that mean? 1,000 pages plus another 500? Even in something we disagree with, it's still massive. As for the judge's reasoning, he determined that requiring educators to use student-preferred programs violated the First Amendment rights. This decision is a significant setback for the Biden administration on its last days, and LGBTQ plus advocate efforts to extend protections to transgender students. Republican-led states, including Idaho, Tennessee, Kentucky, and others, have challenged the expansion of Title IX in court. But in short, this ruling effectively returns Title IX's interpretation to its previous status and focuses solely on biological sex discrimination. And speaking of things over there in Congress and DC, Idaho Congressman Russ Fulcher has co-sponsored H.R. 221, a bill to abolish the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or as we also lovingly know it as, the ATF. The legislation, primarily sponsored by Representative Eric Burlinson, a Republican from Minnesota, aims to dismantle the agency that has faced criticism for overstepping its authority. Many times. I will add that little bit in there. Specifically, Fulcher, a staunch defender of Second Amendment rights, has consistently supported pro-gun legislation throughout his political career. This move comes amid growing frustration among gun owners over the ATF's recent actions, which these recent actions I have heard ad nauseum of. If I hear it again, I'm probably going to pull my hair out, including the controversial rules on bump stocks and pistol braces. Supporters of the bill argue that the ATF has infringed upon its constitutional liberties without consequences. As the first Idaho congressional delegate to back the ATF's abolishment, Fulcher's stance has garnered praise from gun right advocates, including the Idaho Second Amendment Alliance, one of the largest ones here in the state. The bill's proponents contend that the ATF's actions have exceeded its congressional mandate, making it an unnecessary and potentially harmful agency to the United States. Which, on that amazing note, trust me, there's a lot more to get into, but if you've enjoyed it so far, please hit the like button and also the subscribe/follow button, depending on the platform you're on. It helps us stay connected with you and reach more folks who love Idaho just like you. And speaking of bills, but coming to the Idaho legislature, in a continued effort, Idaho lawmakers have introduced House Bill 10, aimed at banning most flags in public school classrooms. The bill, sponsored by Representative Ted Hill, would prohibit displays representing political viewpoints, including LGBTQ+, because we gotta have that in there, pride flags. While the U.S. flag and others would still be allowed, among other more traditional flags, just meaning the more controversial ones. The proposal has, as you can guess, sparked some debate over supposed classroom neutrality and support for LGBT students. As for the debate, supporters argue that the bill creates a neutral learning environment, citing concerns about religious students feeling uncomfortable. However, teachers and the state union worry it may hinder support for LGBTQ students. In conclusion, the bill's fate remains uncertain, as a similar version failed to pass last year, so if it follows that track record, it's going to have issues. That bill did clear the Senate, but stalled in the House Education Committee. This time it's being put forward in the House, so hopefully it can get through committee and through the House, and then in theory it can get through the Senate again. And speaking of the Senate and LGBTQ things, which is the colors of the rainbow, Idaho Senate Minority Leader Melissa Winthrop introduced a personal bill on Thursday to add LGBTQ+, you're going to hear that word a ton in this, protections to the state's Human Rights Act. Senate Bill 1400 seeks to include, quote, sexual orientation and, quote, gender identity, end quote, in the workforce and housing protections. Despite facing certain defeat in the Republican-dominated legislature, Winthrop aims to raise awareness and spark public discussion. The move comes as Republicans push for a U.S. Supreme Court reconsideration of same-sex marriage laws. In response, LGBTQ advocates are planning rallies on January 28th to mark the 10th anniversary of the only hearing held on this issue, only being kind of a cure one there. As for the general takeaway, the contrast between Winthrop's efforts and Republican majority stance here in Idaho highlights, we would argue, a little bit of a disconnect between the Democrat Party's position and what most Idahoans hold to. And bear with me just one more time to hear the LGBTQ stuff. In Idaho, as we're seeing with the last couple stories, a cultural battle has been raging over particularly children and the LGBTQ topic. The main one recently that happened in that was at the Eagle Library and in the state legislature, which we've talked about, kind of summarizing it there. The library's decision to remove its community bulletin board follows a backlash over LGBTQ groups' flyers, underscoring the tension between traditional standards, which are very rooted here in Idaho, and the more modern ones that are trying to take root. Specifically, like we said, House Bill 10, represented by Representative Ted Hill, aims to limit classroom decorations to flags representing national, state, military, tribal, and school affiliations, effectively barring pride flags. Kind of weird they don't fall in any of those. They might fit in nations or empires because we fly it like that. Critics argue this move stifles identity expression, while supporters question the necessity of sexual orientation flags in an educational setting, emphasizing the need for a neutral environment focused on learning. But going a little deeper into it, I would argue that this debate isn't merely about flags or flyers, but more deeply, it's about safeguarding the innocence of our youth from sexualization. The Idaho Republican Party's resolution for that fact affirms that pride events are inherently sexual, reflecting broader concerns among conservatives about our society's direction. As Idahoans, I would argue we must navigate this cultural divide with wisdom and a commitment to our children's well-being. The removal of pride flags from classrooms and the cautious approach to library content are steps towards reclaiming public spaces that reflect our values of decency and traditional family structures. And going out of the LGBTQ thing, but the other hot topic issue, but this won't be in Oregon, but bear with me, I'll tie it back in. Washington pharmacists are now prescribing abortion pills via telehealth without requiring proof of residency, a move that could undermine Idaho's pro-life laws. A pilot program launched by Uplift International, see, it's international, that gives you a hint there, trained 10 pharmacists to prescribe melapristone and mifepristone to patients up to 10 weeks of gestation. Between October 31st and November 26, 2024, 43 eligible patients received prescriptions. To qualify, patients must be 18 or older and provide a valid Washington's address for mailing. As for what this has to do with Idaho, you might have already put the bits together. This development poses a significant danger for North Idaho, which shares a border with Washington. Idaho's near total abortion ban aims to protect the sanctity of life, but Washington's policies could enable Idahoans to circumvent these laws, potentially leading to increased abortions among Idaho residents. This undermines our state's effort to uphold the value of life and protecting the unborn. But moving forward and kind of putting that all together, Uplift International plans to expand this program across Washington and explore in-person prescriptions at brick-and-mortar pharmacies. By doing this, Idahoans may increasingly turn to these services, creating a moral and legal conflict between the two states, highlighting the need for civil vigilance in protecting Idaho's pro-life values and ensuring its laws are not bypassed through cross-border initiatives. Which, if you haven't heard about any of these stories or just know people that would love to hear it or need to hear it, please don't hesitate to share this episode. Your shares help us spread the word about our beautiful state and help people to be engaged and informed about what's going on in it. And speaking about bills and our neighbors doing things that we kind of don't like, in Idaho, a new bill introduced by Representative Bruce Skog aims to establish a $300 minimum fine for marijuana possession. Specifically, looking at that bill there, which includes minors, it seeks to address inconsistent penalties for first-time offenders. Skog, determined to prevent Idaho from becoming a, quote, marijuana state, end quote, argues that legalization has not improved living conditions elsewhere. This move comes after his previous attempt to implement a $420 fine failed due to concerns over its severity. While Skog claims marijuana impairment can last up to a week, health experts suggest effects typically subside within hours. As many of us know, Idaho remains an outlier, with all of our neighboring states except Wyoming having legalized cannabis in some form or another. But pulling that together, there have been attempts to legalize medical marijuana, but they have failed. Public opinion on it is very divided, with some polls indicating growing support, but as we just said, in practice, attempts to change the status quo here in Idaho have mainly failed for both medical and recreational use among Idahoans. The bill now awaits a public hearing in the House committee, so if you're someone that's interested in this topic, want to have broader context, I would highly recommend listening to those committees or going to them, because it's really good to see some viewpoints you wouldn't have otherwise, or let alone if you already think you have a position on this, going and speaking and testifying at them is probably your best course of action. And the hippies like the marijuana, but one thing they also like is the environment. And speaking of the environment and something that will affect every Idahoan, a new environmental impact study for the lower Snake River dams is set to begin, because we need another one of those, reigniting the debate between conservation groups and economic interests. For its part, that study, being done by the Bureau of Reclamations and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, announced their intent to prepare a supplemental environmental impact statement on December 18th, 2024. This decision comes as in recent years, the controversy surrounding the dam's impact on salmon and steelhead population has been getting more vocal, specifically under the Biden administration. As for the debate on it, conservation groups and tribes view the dams as the primary obstacle for fish migration and why the fish aren't reproducing like they used to, air quotes. While power entities, the Port of Lewiston, the Idaho Farm Bureau, and many conservative Idahoans oppose the dam breaching under the argument that the dams provide cheap, clean, reliable power for Idahoans and water for farmers. The study aims to address the complex issues surrounding the salmon recovery, rural economies, and agricultural transportation, which, if you didn't know, the dams up north actually let them transport a lot of goods and different stuff around that they would have to ship over cars another way, which, carbon emissions if you don't like those. But in conclusion, despite record-breaking sockeye salmon numbers in 2024, wink wink, conservationists argue that current fish populations are still far below historic levels. The outcome of this study could have far-reaching implications for Idaho's rural communities, power industry, the fishing industry, and wheat farmers who rely on the river for transportation, among other things. And speaking of the great outdoors and public areas, which we have a lot of here in Idaho and in Utah, in a surprising turn of events, the U.S. Supreme Court has rejected Utah's ambitious lawsuit seeking to control 18.5 million acres of federal land. The court's one-sentence order denying the state's motion to file a bill of complaint has dealt a significant blow to Utah's and other western states' long-standing efforts to gain authority over their vast public lands. Keyword there being, there, because it's, in the state, but we'll get into that a little bit more. For the lawsuit's part, which aim to transfer control of about 34% of Utah's total area from the Bureau of Land Management to the state, is seen as a potential game changer for public land management across the western United States. Conservation groups, as you can guess, celebrated the court's decision, viewing it as a victory for preserving public access to these lands. As for how this ties into Idaho, glad you asked. The implications of this decision extend beyond Utah, resonating strongly in Idaho. Idaho's public lands are at the center of the heated debate, with Attorney General Rao Labrador filing a briefing in support of Utah's lawsuit, mainly being also the fact that they control, I think it's more than 40% of our land here in Idaho is under state federal control. Not great. Proponents of the state control argue that it would increase revenue from timber, grazing, and mining, providing economic benefits to Idahoans and allowing for better management of these lands that are done closer by people that actually know them, not by someone in Washington. However, critics fear the loss of recreational access and the possibility of lands being sold to the highest bidder is just not worth the trade-off. As the debate rages on, it highlights the broader tension between state and federal control of public lands, questioning whether the federal government should control 30 to 50% of a state's land. This contentious issue will continue to shape the future, for sure, out here west in the United States. Now, one more court thing. I know we're going to have a ton of them. I swear they're all over the place. I've never talked about court more than I started doing local yokel. But talking about farmers, a recent court ruling has opened new avenues for Idaho farmers and ranchers to challenge federal agencies' actions. The Jarkissi versus SEC in 2022 decision affirms that administrative agencies cannot act as both prosecutor and judge. I don't know, novel idea there. Allowing agricultural stakeholders to demand jury trials in federal court instead of facing internal agency rulings. What does that exactly mean? Well, this applies to cases involving fines or penalties from agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, I know you're thinking of a different thing there, or Environmental Protection Agency, otherwise known as the EPA. The ruling emphasizes that penalties must comply with constitutional protections, potentially allowing challenges to fines related to grazing, water use, or environmental violations. But moving forward, this development gives Idaho's agricultural community much needed leverage in negotiating with federal agencies, potentially leading to fairer outcomes in disputes over land use, water rights, and environmental regulations, because we desperately need that, especially over in Washington and Oregon. And going back to the swamp we talked about, Idaho Senator Mike Crapo and Jim Risch introduced legislation last Thursday, the 16th, to add a third federal district judgeship in Idaho, addressing the state's growing population and overburdened court system, which we have reported about. Specifically looking at the bill there, it aims to alleviate the judicial emergency that has plagued Idaho for years, with only 2 judicial judges serving a population that has nearly tripled since the last judgeship was added in 1954. The arguments that they have given is that the additional judge is crucial for managing increased caseloads and ensuring efficient justice for Idahoans. Idaho's rapid growth, ranking 4th nationally in percentage of population increase in 2023, and also we hit 2 million, go check out one of the other midweek reports on that, has put significant pressure on our court system. The state's federal judges have struggled to keep up with the growing caseload, especially since COVID-19 pandemic, as you can kind of guess on that, resulted in longer wait times for justice in federal cases. As for the general takeaway, if passed, the legislation would help Idaho catch up with other states in terms of judicial resources, as we currently have the fewest federal judges of any state. And speaking of accountability, but this one going more to our Attorney General, a new bill here in Idaho would grant Attorney General Rao Labrador the power to investigate and prosecute city elected officials for criminal activities. Specifically looking at that legislation, it was introduced by Representative Bruce Scott, man, he's on a roll right now, a Republican from Nampa, and Representative Chris Bruce, a Republican from Kuna. It aims to expand the AG's authority, which currently only covers county officials. As for their arguments on it, Skarg argues this bill would provide an impartial investigative option when local prosecutors face conflicts of interest due to personal relationships. He cited examples of potential misuse of city funds or credit cards by officials. But adding a little context to that, the bill's introduction follows a similar proposal in 2024, which passed the House but failed in the Senate by a very close vote, kind of swapping it compared to the last bill we talked about. But if approved, this legislation could significantly impact local government and accountability in Idaho. The House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee unanimously approved the bill's introduction, paving the way for a public hearing and a vote in the coming weeks. And speaking of another legislation and something that affects any of us that talk about the news, me or others, Idaho's 2025 legislative session with Senator Brian Lenny is definitely rolling along, where he has introduced a bill to dismiss frivolous lawsuits for the second consecutive year. The proposed legislation aims to protect citizens from strategic lawsuits against public precipitation, or SLAPs, which are often used to intimidate critics and stifle free speech. For some added context, because I didn't even know a ton about these, this move comes as other states have recently made changes to their anti-SLAPP laws. This bill could likely provide defendants with expedited motions to dismiss, stays on discovery, and potential for recovery on attorney fees. Governor Brad Little's Keep Promises plan does not explicitly mention anti-SLAPP legislation, but here again, this is something that Lenny's been pushing for. However, the governor's emphasis on government efficiency and protecting vulnerable citizens does align in the spirit of an anti-SLAPP law, so might move along in there very nicely. As the legislative session progresses, whether Idaho will join other states with anti-SLAPP protections remains to be seen, but, maybe a third time's a charm. And coming to our last story here, and a good one, I wanted to save it on a positive one. Michael Boren, an Idaho businessman, has been appointed by now President Trump as the Undersecretary of Natural Resources and Environment at the Department of Agriculture. Known for founding Clearwater Analytics, Boren's appointment, like most of them, comes with some legal disputes. One of them that's kind of been dug up is over his use of an airstrip on his property, Hell Roaring Ranch property in the Sawtooth National Recreational Area. That probably won't have much bearing. But despite that legal part, Boren's experience as a volunteer firefighter for the Sawtooth Valley Regional Fire Department and his role as the board member for the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation has been highlighted as qualifications for his new position. Trump praised Boren's commitment to public service in his announcement, but looking at the appointment's overall reaction, it has garnered support from Idaho officials, with Governor Little calling it, quote, a win for all Western states, end quote. Senator Jim Risch expressed enthusiasm, noting that, quote, finally, an Idaho voice will be at the table when it comes to forest management, end quote. But in all this and moving forward, as Boren prepares to take on his new role, we wait to see how his business experience will influence his approach to managing natural resources and the environment at the national level and here in Idaho. Which, speaking of Idaho, it's looking nicer and nicer outdoors, so I will have to let you go there because I want to go enjoy it. Thank you for listening to the entire report. I sincerely hope you found it enjoyable and valuable. If you liked the Midweek Report, please make sure to check out our other content. We're constantly improving on it. Also, if we missed any important points or provided incorrect information, please feel free to reach out to us via email or Twitter. With the small team we have, we're not able to cover everything, but we do our best to cover the most interesting and important stories. Thank you for your continued support and assistance. That's all for now. I wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Godspeed.